Buenos días. Bienvenida, directora, doña Paula Pinho, y muchas gracias por acompañarnos y haber hecho el esfuerzo de incluirnos en tu agenda. Bien, en este 12º simposio debatimos el papel esencial de la industria desde un enfoque que concuerda, lógicamente, con lo que son los objetivos que desde hace ya años defiende la Unión Europea y defienden otros muchos países, pero en nuestro, ámbito concreto de defensa de la descarbonización en un proceso de transición que tiene dos etapas fundamentales, la de 2030 y la de un objetivo final de emisiones netas cero en 2050. Y hoy la pelota está en la innovación, en el progreso tecnológico, en el cambio de los modelos de producción. Es evidente que una transformación tan trascendental como la que se supone hemos de poder alcanzar en 2050, tiene que asegurar un proceso de crecimiento de una forma distinta, con una gestión de los recursos y con unos desarrollos tecnológicos nuevos. Y aquí está, el reto que tenemos sobre nuestras mesas y que hoy ocupa este debate y al cual también nos ha conducido la Ley de Industria de marzo del 23 de la Unión Europea. De hecho, recordemos que la Unión Europea, que fue el líder, precisamente la vicepresidenta del Gobierno de España, que hoy acaba de hacernos la presentación de este evento con su conferencia, participó activamente como directora del IDRI en Francia en la cumbre de 2015. Y ese liderazgo de Europa, por convicción política y también por convencimiento científico, ha llevado a un despliegue regulatorio que ha abarcado gran cantidad de ámbitos que van desde la energía en su inicio a cuestiones relacionadas con las emisiones que afectan a un conjunto mayor de sectores y que el paquete de energía limpia para todos los europeos, en los que Paula participó y ya presentó en Madrid en un acto de Funseam, fue una de las protagonistas. Y sin duda esa experiencia y esa presencia en ese trayecto regulatorio largo y muy denso, lo ha vivido en el Pacto Verde Europeo y en la Ley Europea del Clima, que son para todos los que nos dedicamos a este tema, pues diría casi como junto con los Objetivos 55 y el Repower European Union, los documentos de referencia, casi como lo que tienes encima de tus diferentes mesas de trabajo inmediatamente para consultar, o simplemente a través de los enlaces que hay para esos documentos en la web de la Unión Europea, lo cual también nos facilita indudablemente mucho el trabajo. Y este nuevo enfoque introduce además cosas enormemente relevantes, que es una concepción holística, es decir, integradora de todos los agentes, de todos los aspectos que, constituyen la esfera social, que afecta a aspectos individuales como aspectos colectivos. Esa nueva senda de crecimiento económico que quiero insistir en resaltar porque es la conjunción de unos deseos de bienestar de la sociedad con también unos deseos de alcanzar un mejor bienestar en otros aspectos que colindan estrictamente los bienes materiales que hoy conocemos y que suponen ese compromiso que implica pues, un uso, como decía antes, distinto de los recursos, pero también un cambio en la gobernanza de las empresas, la imprescindible colaboración público-privada, no solo ya para los proyectos de inversión, sino para la codecisión y compartir los escenarios de futuro como escenarios de interés común. Y, por supuesto, el progreso tecnológico y la innovación. La regulación europea primero ha seguido esa trazabilidad ya basada en unos objetivos identificados, estables y consolidados, pero ha tenido también que afrontar situaciones de gran incertidumbre sobrevenidas. Yo creo que ha sido enormemente difícil cómo encajar el mantener estos objetivos con las consecuencias de la guerra de Ucrania. Yo creo que el documento del Recovery European Union ha ayudado, además introduciendo una cuestión novedosa en lo que son, digamos, los grandes programas de política energética o climática o política económica en general, que es el de la solidaridad, y más el de la solidaridad entre países, y que se ha alcanzado de forma material y manifiesta en el tema del gas, en el que España, si me permites, ha jugado un papel muy importante gracias al sistema de infraestructuras gasistas que tenemos. Hoy, por consiguiente, en esta nueva etapa que yo creo que se abre con la Ley de Industria, vamos a estar trabajando a lo largo del día. Y nadie mejor que Paula Pinho, que ha sido protagonista de acuerdos y desarrollos regulatorios a lo largo de un periodo muy importante, que nos dé cuenta de ello. Y aunque es persona muy conocida, me voy a permitir compartir el placer de recordar conjuntamente su currículum. Paula Pinho es directora en la Dirección General de Energía de la Comisión Europea, responsable de Transición Justa, Consumidores, Eficiencia Energética e Innovación y Seguridad Energética. Previamente asumió la coordinación de la estrategia de política energética y posteriormente también de la política de renovables e integración del sistema energético y de descarbonización y sostenibilidad de las fuentes energéticas. Ha sido también directora interina de política energética, donde supervisó de forma destacada las relaciones energéticas internacionales, los instrumentos financieros y las relaciones interinstitucionales. Fue también responsable de Seguridad Energética e Infraestructura y de la Coordinación General de la Dimensión Internacional de la Política Energética. Ha sido miembro del Gabinete de Comisarios de la Unión Europea y como miembro del Gabinete ha participado en las conversaciones trilaterales sobre gas entre la Unión Europea, Rusia y Ucrania. Como jefa de unidad responsable de la estrategia energética y la coordinación de políticas, Paula coordinó la preparación y adopción del paquete Energía Limpia para todos los europeos. Representó a la Comisión en las negociaciones de la propuesta de la Comisión de Reglamentos sobre la gobernanza de la Unión de la Energía y fue responsable de la coordinación general de la evolución de los planes nacionales de energía y clima. Podría hacer más referencias de un largo recorrido como gran responsable regulatoria en temas de energía, pero creo que, Paula, tenemos el placer y le agradecemos que haya podido venir y lo que queremos es escucharla. The floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, María Teresa, por todas las palabras muy gentiles. Muchas gracias a Funseam por esa invitación. Señoras y señores, bueno, si me permiten, voy a reemplazar mi portuñol por un inglés, que es más fácil para mí. Bueno, es que our efforts in ensuring that we have a sustainable industry, a decarbonized and competitive industry in the EU are not new. We have been working on this for a long, long time. But it is fair to say that in the past years, we've seen a real acceleration of these efforts. And it started with the European Green Deal, where the vision of achieving a climate neutral energy system by 2050 was put into place, being the first climate neutral continent in the world. And this was then reflected by saying, in order to do that, we need to have 55% of decrease of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And this was accompanied by a number of legal proposals, the Fit for 55. And when setting this path for an energy transition, we said we need to respect three big principles. We need to make sure that we ensure security, we need to ensure that the transition is sustainable, but we need to ensure also that the transition is affordable for everyone to be able to be part of it. Now, the past 2 years with the war in Ukraine have put our focus very much on the first pillar, energy security. Let's make sure first that we have the energy that we need. And it was incredibly difficult because it exposed our dependence on gas, on our dependence on imports of fossil fuels from a main supplier, from Russia. And today, it's fair to say that thanks to the work of all of us member states, citizens, industry, in the EU and at national level, we managed to overcome that crisis. But at what cost? And that was actually the prices, the energy prices, was the first element that came up, even before the war started in Ukraine. And I remember that for me personally, the first alert was actually triggered by an interview that Vice President Teresa Costa gave in the summer 2021. I remember I was in Portugal in my holidays and I read an interview by Vice President Teresa Costa saying the prices of energy are going up. There is something wrong about this. We need to look into it. And I immediately triggered the teams in Brussels and saying, indeed, what is happening here? It was a first signal that something was being cooked. And before the war, we started seeing prices going up of energy, and we looked into why, and we saw the levels of gas storage in the EU everywhere were pretty low, but especially those owned by a company called Gazprom. And so this was the first indication that something was being cooked, the prices before the energy security. And then it has led, indeed, to energy security issues. So with the prices, we were reminded of the need to ensure affordability, to make sure that all citizens can be part of it. But interestingly, we also realized with this energy crisis that the long-term response to energy security and to affordability is sustainability. So as we worked on the emergency measures, and there were many that we put into place, at the same time we continued to work on the structural measures, meaning that we need to integrate more renewables in our energy system, we need to seize the potential of energy efficiency, we need to have a market design for electricity which will bring prices down in a more sustainable manner. So those were the structural measures that we continued to work, and at the same time we had the Repower EU plan, which was about saying by 2027 we need to phase out our imports of fossil fuels from Russia. And this is immense, bearing in mind that we were starting with 40% of imports, of our imports were coming from Russia, and we are now down to 9%, which is incredible, and I wouldn't have believed it if I was asked 2 years ago that we would be able to do it. And as we tackled this trilemma of affordability, security, sustainability, and have been more or less been able to navigate it, then comes a fourth element, which is, well, we have to do all of that, but at the same time, we also need to ensure that our industry in the EU remains competitive. And as if it was not enough. So making sure sustainable, affordable, secure, but at the same time, we don't want everything to come from China. We also want to have resilient industry in the EU who will produce the technologies that we need to decarbonize. So if we didn't have enough, now we have another challenge to add to it. And let us not forget, the International Energy Agency has estimated that about 35% of the CO2 emission reductions that we need for 2050 will come from technologies that are not yet in the market. So this gives you an indication of how much we also need to mobilize, and how much the industry needs to mobilize. And as we tackle this, of course, the big question is, and how do we finance all of it? Because it's easier said than done, and the financing of this will be and is a challenge. Now, just to give you some examples of the legislation which was recently adopted, some of it still provisionally, but that should be concluded very soon at EU level. We have first the very popular electricity market design reform, and it was about enabling more renewable energy to be part of the energy system that will eventually allow for the energy bills to go down, that will foresee longer-term contracts, such as power purchase agreements, and by requiring the use of two-way contracts for difference, for new investments where public financing is needed, and also it will create the conditions for the use of flexibility solutions such as demand response and storage. So really reforming some of the elements and allowing that renewables, at the end of the day, for a longer time, sets the final price of energy, and it's not always dependent on gas. Another important legal instrument was the Energy Efficiency Directive, where we ended up with a target for 2030, which is even more ambitious than what the Commission put forward, which shows that everybody in the member states was behind pushing, and Spain also, in pushing a more ambitious target for 2030 for energy efficiency. And for companies, it means that they too are encouraged to become more energy efficient, including, for instance, the need to do an energy management system and an energy audit, which will identify what are the processes that can become more efficient. And it's very interesting when I hear now industry telling us how did they manage to bring down demand. Of course, there was one aspect which we don't like to hear, which is demand destruction. Some industry had to close down because of the prices, because of what was happening in Ukraine. But some of it was also triggered by the discovery, all of a sudden, in energy efficient manufacturing processes. And when I hear, for instance, many companies in Germany, which could rely on cheap gas for a long time, did not even question the manufacturing processes, and all of a sudden, with the high prices, had to look into making the manufacturing more efficient, and realize that actually, at very low investments, they could do these investments. So our hope is that this efficiency improvements will not go back. This will be a structural change which will allow us all to produce and manufacture in more efficient ways. Another piece of legislation very important was the Renewables Directive, where also we ended up with a target which is more ambitious than the one we had initially in the Commission proposal. And it will also allow for faster permitting procedures. We know that this is a problem when we want to install new capacity of renewables, be it wind, be it solar, but it gets stuck in the permitting Now we'll have accelerated permitting procedures. We will have the possibility for member states to put into place dedicated acceleration areas. And for the first time, the Renewables Directive also foresees a sub-target for industry, notably an indicative target of 1.6% of annual increase in the use by industry of renewable energy. So all of this should bring us really and accelerate the decarbonization of the energy system. Another piece of legislation was the decarbonization of gas, which will allow and facilitate the connection of renewable and low-carbon gases to the existing gas grid. As we decarbonize gas, but we will have hydrogen, we will have other types of decarbonized gases, we need to prepare the grid for that, and this is what this legislation will enable it. It will at the same time establish a certification system for low-carbon gases, as well as a market design for hydrogen, and we've heard it already this morning, where Spain is really making big steps in positioning itself as a pioneer within the EU. And none of this, and here I really have to express a word of a big thanks and appreciation to Vice President Teresa Ribera personally, and all the team of the Spanish presidency, who did a magnificent job in the last semester last year and actually managed to get all these pieces of legislation concluded, and now we require a vote in the European Parliament, but it was an excellent work with a very strong leadership. And now we have one piece of legislation which is still remaining, but which was also put on the table later on, and actually I will need to leave, and very sorry for that, I will already need to leave in a couple of hours, because I'm going to a session which we hope will be the last session of negotiations of the Net Zero Industry Act in Strasbourg with the European Parliament and the Council, and where we hope to, like all the other pieces of legislation, to land this. If we don't do it tomorrow, we have one more chance under the Belgian presidency, and then that's over, because we will enter into a new cycle of the European Parliament and the Commission. So fingers crossed that we manage that. And why is this Net Zero Industry Act important? It's precisely to come back to this fourth element, the competitiveness of the EU industry. We cannot replace our dependence on fossil fuels by a new dependence on critical raw materials. And as has been said already this morning, the fact is that today we are highly dependent on the critical raw materials that we need precisely for this clean energy technologies that we require. At least 2/3 of the global production capacity at every stage of the solar panels, the photovoltaic value chain, is concentrated in China. Our photovoltaic demand in the EU is almost exclusively covered by imports, more than 80% coming from China. So we need to tackle this, while at the same time bearing in mind that this is an extremely promising market. The estimation is that the global market for key mass-manufactured net zero technologies is set to triple by 2030 from today, and should reach an annual value of around 600 billion euro. So this is not just a challenge, it's a major opportunity for the industry to position itself. Because, mind you, it's not just the European Union who is going through this major transition. Actually, the whole world is going through this transition. So if our industry is able to position itself strategically in the manufacturing of this clean energy technologies, it's not just the EU market which is out there waiting, it's the whole global market that is waiting. And therefore, it's no surprise that we have the US coming out with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is precisely about attracting manufacturing to the US. it's no surprise that also China is trying to attract investments, because everybody's seeing that there is a huge opportunity. So there's competition going on, and we need to position ourselves there. And we have advantages in several technologies. We may not have it so much in solar, but for instance in wind. And there are several companies active in Spain, for instance, and very interesting projects on wind energy in the production of wind turbines. And I won't quote the companies, not to be accused of quoting some and not the others, but there are active companies in Spain developing wind turbines, for instance. So we need to tackle, as we go through, ensuring competitiveness of the EU industry. On the one hand, we need to have the legislation, and I mentioned one piece, which is this Net Zero Industry Act, and I'll come back to that. We have the Critical Raw Materials Act, and this was concluded under the Spanish presidency in the last semester, which is aimed precisely at facilitating the extraction, the processing, and the recycling of critical raw materials in the EU. And as was said before, we need to make some choices. We cannot say that we don't want coal, we don't want fossil fuels, and we don't want to extract the critical raw materials either in the EU, because we don't like it, we prefer to import it. It requires also difficult decisions in this sense. We cannot have it all. Hence the importance also of this legal proposal when we realize that we are highly dependent on the imports of critical raw materials. And as part of this approach, we also need to bear in mind the need for the people and the skilled people, skills. The worst thing would be if we have the vision, we have the legislation, we even have the financing tools, but then we don't have the people to do the work. Speak of heat pumps, bombas de calor, or lo que sea, and you don't have the installers to do it. And this is becoming an issue. So at the same time, we have to make sure that we have the skilled workforce. And here also a plea to the EU industry. We need to put our act together, and instead of seeing each other within the industry as competitors, see where you can join forces, for instance, in building the skills, the people, the resources we need to actually enable this transition. There it requires cooperation among the industry rather than competition. When it comes to skills, when it comes to training the people, we need to work together, otherwise we will face a big challenge. And now to the Net Zero Industry Act, which, as said, we will be having a session of negotiations, hopefully the last one tomorrow. What is it about? It is precisely about increasing the capacity to manufacture in the EU these clean energy technologies. And we have, in the Commission, proposed that we should be able to meet at least 40% of the EU annual deployment needs for this net zero technologies by 2030 of each technology. It is ambitious. We are also foreseeing to have accelerated permitting for the manufacturing of these clean energy technologies. We are foreseeing market access provisions when, for instance, there is public procurement, when the public authorities are calling for solar, for wind, that there are provisions that allow us to favor, under some conditions, EU manufacturing. This is all what we're looking into. We are also looking into making sure that we have available skilled people who can deploy these clean energy technologies. And we are looking also into the possibility of industry making use of the regulatory sandboxes, experimenting, innovating beyond the strict legal framework. And finally, as said, key, the financing of this transition, which is also foreseen in the Net Zero Industry Act, with some means there, but where we have a much broader approach, and we have, it is fair to say, unprecedented means in terms of financing. Actually, in the current budget of the EU, the so-called multi-financial finance framework, which goes from 2021 to 2027, we had a record of 30% of the 1.8 trillion euro, 30% of it should be going into climate change and decarbonization, which is unprecedented, it's huge. And I'm sure you've all heard about the recovery and resilience plans that members of the European Union are implementing, and there are more than 150 billion euro invested in energy, 2/3 going into energy efficiency, 1/3 into renewables and networks, and there's also, of course, a plan for Spain. The third disbursement was already done, and a lot of these funds are going into the decarbonization of the energy system. So a number of funds at EU level are being geared towards this transition, and the idea is that even if we have unprecedented amounts, it will still not be enough. So it's important to couple that with private investments so that these public funds will actually de-risk the investments, will provide for a first incentive and attract the private funds that should come into it. And again, I hear very often, money is not the problem, but we need the legal certainty, we need the investment certainty, we need the legislative framework, and we are, as said, putting forward a number of financing tools, also increasing and fostering innovation, because as said, there is no decarbonization without innovation, and most of the technologies that we need to decarbonize haven't yet reached the market. So it's been rather long, but I wanted to at least tackle a few key issues in this journey. So it's clear that as we progress and in the deployment of net zero technologies, we need to also accelerate this. This means scaling up public and private investments along the whole value chain, from research to deployment. We need to foster, to motivate the manufacturing of net zero technologies in the EU, avoiding that we replace our dependence on fossil fuels by dependence on technologies and critical raw materials that come essentially from abroad. And here the role of industry is absolutely essential, not just because the industry is a key consumer of energy, but because it is the industry that is actually manufacturing these clean technologies. There's a huge potential in the EU, there's a huge potential in the EU industry, and here I'd like to really leave you with a word of encouragement and the reassurance that we know we are all together in this challenge, but we can build on the competitiveness of the EU industry to ensuring that we supply not just the EU market, but that we also supply globally the whole world as we go globally through an energy transition. Therefore, thank you very much again for this invitation, and I wish you very productive discussions today. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. Gracias, Paula. Tenemos retos, pero tenemos oportunidades. Es una nueva fase en la transición energética de altísima exigencia que obliga a un cambio muy profundo en el mundo industrial, pero que entiendo que los fondos de financiación pueden ayudar a esta toma de decisiones. Sí que nada más ya para pasar ya al coffee break. Yo creo que una de las cosas que más nos pueden preocupar, hay fondos, hay empresarios y la lógica del mercado lleva a que esas inversiones públicas privadas pues den los retornos suficientes para que las iniciativas empresariales vayan en este camino, pero posiblemente el tema de los skills, el tema de las capacidades, ¿no?, para poder afrontar estos nuevos trabajos sea una de las cuestiones más complicadas, porque esto requiere un periodo de maduración elevado. En un trabajo reciente que hemos hecho, pues ponía de manifiesto que en una oferta de empleo de 200.000 puestos de trabajo a nivel mundial que ofrecía el sector energético, los requerimientos eran de unos niveles que difícilmente, al menos en nuestro país, encajaban con los perfiles de la oferta de trabajo. Y esto yo creo que sí que es un tema en que, con la ayuda y la dirección de la Unión Europea, unos países lo tenemos que resolver de forma más rápida que otros, que tienen un conocimiento acumulado del manejo tecnológico y del cambio mucho más consolidado que nosotros. Gracias de nuevo, Paula, y vamos a seguir con el evento. Gracias a todos.